The prison ship moved through cold space like a black shadow, its heavy engines making the whole hull shake with every slow movement. Inside the dim corridors, alien guards stood in silence, their armor dark and scratched from years of service, their long weapons ready in their hands. Everyone knew today was no normal day. Today they would receive a Class 15 Deathworlder, and that word alone made even the toughest among them shift nervously. Deathworlders came from planets so dangerous that every day was a fight to live, and humans were said to be the worst of them all. The Maw, the prison where this ship was headed, was feared in every star system. It was not built for rehabilitation or mercy. It was built to break. Every wall was thick with cold steel. Every cell was designed to crush the spirit. The inmates inside were killers, warlords, monsters from worlds where mercy had no meaning. Even the guards were not truly free. They served long terms to pay debts or survive political punishment, and all of them believed that one wrong step inside the Maw could be their last. The warden stood at the docking bay, his tall reptilian frame wrapped in black command robes. His scales were dull gray from age, and his eyes narrow with suspicion. He had seen every type of prisoner before, but humans were rare. He spoke in a low voice to the assembled guards, warning them that a Deathworld human was not like the others. They were strong in ways that had nothing to do with muscle. They could survive wounds that would kill others. They could think fast under pressure. They could turn enemies into allies with words alone. And most dangerous of all, they never stopped fighting for life. The airlock hissed open with a sharp burst of steam. Every guard lifted their weapon, expecting a violent burst of motion, but instead a tall figure stepped out slowly, wearing a plain gray jumpsuit, his hair short and dark, his eyes calm, his hands behind his back in the prisoner's clasp. The man looked around as if stepping into an ordinary room, and then he smiled. It was not the smile of fear or madness. It was a warm and almost friendly smile, and that alone made the nearest guards grip their weapons tighter. This was Captain Ray Carter, once a soldier, once a traitor, and now a prisoner of the Maw. His file said he had survived 3 years on the surface of Korth Prime, a planet where even the rain was acidic. His record also showed that he had defeated a crew of 12 armed raiders with nothing but improvised tools. Yet when the warden looked at him, he saw no rage, no defiance, only a strange kind of ease, as if this terrible place was just another stop on a long journey. 2 guards with heavy chains stepped forward, their insect-like eyes fixed on Ray. But he moved willingly, not resisting as the cold cuffs locked around his wrists. He even tilted his head and asked one of them how their day was going. The question made the guard freeze for a heartbeat. No prisoner had ever spoken to him that way. They either spat curses or stayed silent. Yet this human spoke, as if greeting a neighbor. The prisoners watching from the upper tiers leaned forward to get a better look. Some jeered, some made threats, their voices echoing off the steel walls. A hulking 4-armed brute from the high security wing roared in challenge, but Ray only glanced up and gave a small nod. The kind of nod you might give to someone holding open a door. The response was so unexpected that the roar faded into confused silence. The warden ordered the guards to move him to cell block 9, the deepest and most dangerous section of the prison, a place where the lights were always dim and the smell of oil and rust never faded. As Ray was led through the corridors, he kept looking around like a tourist, taking in every detail, counting steps, watching the doors, but never showing fear. The guards found themselves exchanging glances, unsure whether to feel wary or curious. When they reached his cell, a narrow space with a metal bed and a single dim light, Ray stepped inside without hesitation. The door clanged shut behind him. The warden lingered for a moment, studying the human through the thick glass, waiting for him to break the silence with begging or threats. But Ray simply sat on the bed, leaned back against the wall, and looked directly at the warden with that same warm smile, the kind of smile that felt like a puzzle. Something about that moment unsettled everyone, because in the Maw there were only 2 kinds of faces, the faces of those who had given up, and the faces of those who fought like cornered beasts. But Ray Carter had neither. He had the face of a man who knew something they did not, and that was perhaps the most dangerous thing of all. As the warden walked away, he felt the first prickling of doubt in many years, wondering if bringing a human here had been a mistake. While in his cell, Ray closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the distant hum of the prison's power lines. every vibration in the walls telling him more about this place than any file could. And when he opened them again, his smile was still there, calm and steady, as if the maw had no power over him at all. The morning inside the maw began not with light or warmth, but with the deep metallic groan of the wake sirens. The sound rolled through the prison like the growl of a hungry beast, shaking the steel bars and the tired bones of everyone inside. For most prisoners, this was the sound of another day in chains, another day of survival, another day of watching the clock tick slowly toward nothing. But for Ray Carter, this was the first morning in the worst prison in the galaxy and the beginning of his quiet war. When the heavy cell door slid open with a hiss of pressurized air, Ray stood calmly, stepping out into the cold corridor where two alien guards waited, their insectoid heads clicking softly as they adjusted their grip on stun rifles, their armor bore dents from past fights, and the faint smell of burned plasma still clung to them. They led him toward the mess hall, a wide chamber where the ceiling hung low and the light flickered in sickly green and yellow. The smell of oil mixed with the sour stench of unwashed bodies and alien food that had been cooked far too long. Voices rumbled all around, some sharp with threat, others low with plotting, and eyes followed Ray's every step. The mess hall was filled with beings from across 100 star systems, scaled and furred, armored in shells or bare-skinned with tattoos marking kills. Some had claws that scratched the tables. Others had eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. Each one carried the weight of crimes that had sent them here. Yet even in this place, one thing united them all: the belief that the maw belonged to the inmates, not the guards, and certainly not to newcomers, especially not humans who came from worlds whispered about in stories, told to frighten young recruits. Ray collected a tray of gray, steaming food that smelled faintly like engine grease. He scanned the room and noticed a table where no one sat, but he did not take it. Instead, he walked to a table near the middle where 3 alien prisoners sat together, their skin pale blue and covered in faint ridges. They stared at him in silence as he placed his tray down and sat without asking. He nodded at them in greeting and began eating as if nothing about this place could unsettle him. After long pause, one of them leaned forward and asked why a human would choose to sit with strangers on his first day. Ray only smiled and said that strangers were just friends he had not met yet. The alien frowned, clearly unsure whether the human was being naive or dangerously confident. The room's attention sharpened when a massive figure rose from the far side of the hall, the four-armed brute from the night before, Croft, whose skin was dark red like rusted iron, muscles coiled and thick as steel cables. Each step shook the floor as he approached. Prisoners leaned back to watch. Guards shifted, but did not interfere. Croft stopped beside Ray's table and stared down. His lower arms crossed over his chest, while his upper hands rested on the edge of the table. His voice was deep, enough to make the trays rattle as he told Ray that no one sat in the middle unless they were ready to defend it. Ray looked up at him with calm eyes and asked if he wanted to join them for breakfast. The words were so unexpected that Croft blinked, unsure if this was a joke or an insult. Ray then told a short-earth joke about a bear walking into a bar, and though most did not understand, a few prisoners, and even a guard nearby, let out a surprised laugh. Croft stared for another moment, then slowly moved away without saying more. The tension broke like glass underfoot. Quiet murmurs spread across the hall. This human was either very stupid or very dangerous, and neither answer brought comfort. The guards exchanged small looks, realizing they were seeing something rare, a prisoner who could change the air in the room without throwing a punch. After breakfast, the new inmates were led to the yard, a wide open space covered in dark gravel beneath a dome that showed only the shadowed swirl of the planet's toxic clouds. High above, armed guards patrolled narrow walkways, their weapons always angled down. In one corner, groups of prisoners lifted heavy scrap metal for strength. In another, they traded stolen goods under the watch of lookouts. Ray walked slowly across the yard, studying faces, memorizing the layout, counting every guard and every camera. He was not looking for escape yet. He was mapping the territory like a soldier planning a campaign. A group of insectoid inmates with sharp limbs and hard black eyes began following him. Their leader, a tall one with jagged mandibles, clicked in amusement and asked if the human knew the rules. Ray turned and asked what the rules were. The insectoid said that the first rule was that newcomers pay respect to those who run the yard. Ray tilted his head and said he would rather play a game. The insectoid tilted his head back in confusion. Ray crouched slightly and explained the simple Earth game, called rock, paper, scissors, demonstrating with his hands. The watching prisoners were puzzled, but the guards on the high walkways were already leaning forward to see what would happen. The insectoid leader decided to play, perhaps expecting a trick. They counted together, and when Ray's hand showed paper while the alien's claw showed rock, Ray grinned and declared himself the winner. Then, to the astonishment of everyone, he handed over the bread roll from his pocket as a prize. The insectoid stared at the bread, then back at Ray, unsure whether this was mockery or generosity. In the end, they took the bread and walked away without a fight. The crowd muttered with surprise. The guards above shared glances. It had been months since they had seen anything in the yard that was not pure violence. By the time the yard session ended, the story of the human who played games instead of fighting had already spread through 3 blocks. Some laughed, some thought he was mad, but all were now curious. Back in his cell, Ray sat cross-legged on the bed, watching the dim light flicker against the wall. Hearing the distant thrum of the prison generators, he thought about the way the guards had looked at him, not with hatred but with something like interest. He thought about Crotha's hesitation and the insectoid's confusion. These were small shifts, but shifts nonetheless. In a place like the maw, small shifts could lead to cracks, and cracks could be widened into doors. When the evening siren wailed and the lights turned to deep red for night cycle, Ray lay back and stared at the ceiling. He knew that tomorrow would bring more tests, more eyes watching, more pressure from those who believed the maw should remain under their control. Yet he also knew that he had begun planting something in this cold soil, a seed of unpredictability, the kind that could grow into alliances or into chaos depending on how it was tended. He closed his eyes with that same calm smile he had worn since the moment he stepped off the transport ship, the smile that made even the most hardened guards wonder if they were looking at a prisoner or at something far more dangerous. And as the prison settled into the uneasy quiet of its artificial night, far above in the warden's office the reptilian commander stood by the viewing screen, watching the human still form in the cell, his mind replaying every strange move, every word, every smile. And though he told himself that the human would eventually break like all the others, a small voice inside whispered that perhaps this time it might be the maw itself that bent first. The next cycle in the maw began with a low hum in the walls and the slow rise of pale green lights across the cell blocks. The heavy air felt thicker than usual, carrying a scent of metal dust and recycled air. In his cell, Ray Carter sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting loosely on his knees, eyes half closed as if listening to something far away. He could hear the distant movements of other prisoners, the heavy footsteps of guards, and the faint vibration of machinery deep in the lower levels. To most it was meaningless noise, but to Ray it was information, a constant pulse that told him how the prison was breathing. When the door slid open with its usual hiss, the guard Vesh, a tall, thin alien with smooth gray skin and narrow eyes, gestured for him to move. Vesh rarely spoke, but Ray noticed the way his gaze lingered, as if searching for signs of weakness. They walked through the narrow corridors toward the yard again, other prisoners stepping aside just enough to let them pass, their expressions unreadable yet heavy with thought. Word of the human's strange first day had reached every corner of the prison, and in the maw curiosity was almost as dangerous as hatred. The yard looked different today, not in shape or color, but in the atmosphere. Clusters of inmates spoke in low tones, eyes flicking toward Ray before turning away. High above the guards stood in their usual watch positions, yet their grips on the weapons seemed a little tighter. Somewhere in the shadows between 2 bulk storage units a group of insectoid prisoners waited, the same ones who had played the strange hand game with Ray yesterday, only now their leader's posture was sharper, his movements more precise. Something was brewing, and Ray could feel it like static in the air. He walked toward the central open area, not rushing, not slowing, just moving with the same steady rhythm. A sound like clicking knives grew behind him, and when he turned his head slightly, he saw not just the insectoid group, but another gang merging with them. Reptilian prisoners with jagged teeth and pale scales. They were not allies by nature, which meant they had found a common target. Ray was being tested, and this time it would not be with games or stares. The circle formed around him with casual steps meant to look accidental. Other prisoners drifted to the edges to watch, some leaning against the dome walls, others perched on rusted crates. The guards above shifted positions, but did not intervene, perhaps waiting to see how the human would handle himself. The leader of the reptilian gang, a broad figure named Salek, spoke first, his voice like grinding stone as he told Ray that no one walked into the maw and acted like they owned the place. Ray's eyes met his without flinching, and he replied that he had never owned anything here but his own choices. The words were simple, yet they carried a strange weight that made some in the crowd murmur. Salek stepped closer until his scaled chest almost touched Ray's, his breath carrying the sharp scent of raw meat. He told Ray that today he would learn what choices really looked like in this place. Behind him, the insectoid leader flexed his blade-like forearms, their points glinting faintly in the dim light. Ray scanned the faces around him, noting positions, distances, angles, every detail feeding into a quiet plan forming in his mind. His hands remained relaxed at his sides, but his shoulders shifted slightly, a signal so subtle most would miss it. Yet Vesh, watching from above, saw and frowned as if recognizing something dangerous. The first move came fast. One of the reptilians lunged from Ray's left, aiming a heavy strike toward his ribs. Ray pivoted on his heel, letting the blow slide past him. His elbow snapped up into the attacker's side, not breaking bones, but stealing breath. Before the next strike could land, he stepped forward into the space between Salek and the insectoid leader, forcing them to adjust their positions. Confusion rippled through the attackers. They had expected rage or fear, not this precise redirection of space. Another swung from behind, claws slicing through the air. Ray ducked and rolled forward, coming up on one knee, his hand catching a loose piece of gravel, which he flicked upward into the eyes of an insectoid. Not enough to injure badly, but enough to blur vision. The crowd hissed in surprise. This was not the wild fury of a cornered beast. It was the measured movement of someone who had done this many times before. Salek roared and came at him with both arms raised. Ray stepped inside the arc, placing a palm against the scaled chest and pushing just enough to shift balance. Salek stumbled a step backward, hitting another attacker. The chain of motion disrupted the rhythm of the assault. The circle tightened then loosened as uncertainty spread. Ray straightened slowly, his breathing calm, his voice steady as he told them he would not fight to kill, but he would not fall either. In a place like this, those words were as strange as his earlier smile on arrival. The guards above finally moved, calling for the crowd to break apart. The attackers hesitated, then pulled back, muttering in their own tongues, their faces twisted with a mixture of frustration and reluctant respect. The reptilian leader gave Ray a final glare before turning away. The insectoid leader followed, glancing over his shoulder with an unreadable expression, perhaps considering whether the human was an enemy or something else entirely. As the yard cleared, Vesh came down from the walkway, approaching Ray with a slow, deliberate pace. His voice was low enough that only Ray could hear as he said that next time the attack would not stop without blood. Ray looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. He understood the truth behind the warning. It was not fear of the gangs that made Vesh speak, but recognition, a quiet admission that in the maw standing apart drew storms faster than anything else. Back in the cell later, Ray sat cross-legged once more, the flicker of the overhead light casting long shadows across the narrow walls. He thought about the way the attackers had moved, how quickly they had adapted, how easily they could be turned against each other if pushed at the right angles. He thought about Salek's pride and the insectoid's curiosity, and he thought about the guards, watching every move, weighing whether he was a problem to be contained or a tool to be used. Night cycle came with the deep red glow spilling into the cell blocks, the hum of machinery shifting to a lower pitch. Prisoners settled into uneasy rest, while the endless storm clouds beyond the dome swirled in slow violence. Ray lay back on the hard bed, one arm folded behind his head, his eyes half closed. He was not thinking about escape yet. He was thinking about position, about timing, about the way a single small action could ripple outward in a place like this, turning enemies into allies or allies into shields. The fight today had not been about survival alone. It had been about sending a message that the human would not break in the ways the Maw expected. The Maw was never quiet for long yet. That cycle the silence before trouble came was strange, and heavy like the air before a storm. Ray Carter woke to the sound of a distant mechanical whine deep in the prison's lower levels. It was not part of the normal rhythm of the place. It was sharper, almost like the sound of metal straining under too much weight. He sat up on the hard bed, listening as the faint vibration carried through the floor. The hum of the lights above seemed weaker than usual, a sign that the power systems were shifting, and in the maw any shift meant danger. When the door to his cell slid open, the guards in the corridor moved with a speed that was not normal for routine transfer. Their voices clipped and urgent. The sirens had not sounded yet, but something was already wrong. They herded the prisoners toward the mess hall with unusual haste, and as Ray joined the moving line, he noticed that some of the lights overhead flickered more than others. The smell of burning insulation drifted faintly through the air ducts, a sure sign that a system somewhere was overheating. The mess hall doors opened just as the first alarm finally began to wail, a deep rising tone that echoed through the steel corridors. Guards on the upper walkways shouted orders in their own languages, their armor glinting in the flickering light. Prisoners murmured in confusion, some with the eager look of those sensing an opportunity for chaos. Ray kept scanning the edges of the room, noting exits, guard positions, and the growing tension that rolled like a wave from one end of the hall to the other. A sudden loud crack came from the far wall, a maintenance gate that led to the outer service corridors. The heavy door had shifted off its track during the power fluctuation, and now one of the young alien guards was caught, his leg pinned under the weight of the warped steel. Sparks danced from the door frame as electrical cables snapped. The guard's high-pitched cry cut through the noise. Prisoners in the area began shouting, some in mockery, others in anticipation, for in the maw the suffering of a guard was a rare and tempting sight. The nearest guards hesitated, their weapons raised toward the prisoners rather than the broken gate. Their training told them to hold position and protect order, not to rush into danger without backup. Ray saw this in an instant and understood that the pinned guard had only seconds before the sparking cables ignited the leaking coolant that now pooled beneath the frame. If that happened, the young guard would be burned alive before anyone could react. Without waiting for an order, Ray moved. The crowd shifted as he stepped forward, some jeering, some stepping aside in curiosity. Two guards shouted at him to stop, but he ignored them, moving with the same calm focus he had shown since his arrival. He reached the gate and dropped to one knee, his hands gripping the twisted metal. The heat from the sparking wires stung his skin, but he held tight. He braced one foot against the floor, feeling the weight strain against his arms. Then, with a sharp, controlled breath, he pushed. The warped frame groaned as it rose just enough for the young guard to pull his leg free. Another guard grabbed the injured one and dragged him back toward safety. The crowd of prisoners murmured in disbelief, some unable to understand why a prisoner would risk himself for a guard. Ray stepped back as the frame dropped again with a heavy clang. The sparks hissed louder, but the danger had passed for now. The injured guard looked back at Ray with wide alien eyes, filled not with suspicion but with something closer to gratitude. The warden had arrived by then, his tall reptilian frame looming at the edge of the mess hall, his gaze sweeping over the scene. His voice cut through the air like a blade as he ordered the prisoners back into formation. The guards moved quickly now, driving the crowd toward the exits. Yet even as they moved, Ray could feel the shift in the air. The guard's eyes lingered on him longer than before. The injured one spoke quietly to his commander before being taken to the infirmary, and the other. Guards exchanged short, sharp words that carried a weight he could not yet measure. Back in the yard later that cycle, the atmosphere was different. The gangs who had tested him before kept their distance, some pretending not to notice him at all, others watching from a safe range. The guards' patrol patterns shifted subtly, two of them moving closer to his position than necessary. When he glanced at them, they did not look away, their faces unreadable but no longer cold. Ray knew the language of soldiers, and this was its first sentence here: respect given not by orders, but by action. As the day wore on, whispers moved through the prison like smoke. The human had saved a guard, not for reward, not for leverage, but simply because he could. To some this was foolishness. To others it was a sign of dangerous unpredictability. In the Mon no one acted without calculation, yet Ray had done something that seemed to break the rules of survival here, and that made him either more trustworthy or more dangerous, depending on who was speaking. That night during meal distribution, Vesh approached his table, his long shadow falling across the metal surface, his voice low enough that only Ray could hear as he asked why the human had done it. Ray's answer was simple, because letting someone burn when he could stop it was not his way. Vesh studied him for a long moment before nodding once and walking away, without another word. But Ray caught the faintest shift in his step, a sign of a thought that would not leave quickly. When the red lights of night cycle returned, Ray lay back on his bed staring at the ceiling, his body still holding the ache from lifting the heavy gate. Yet his mind was clear. He had seen something in the faces of the guards today, a spark that could be built into trust or loyalty if handled carefully. He knew it would also make him a bigger target for the gangs who thrived on keeping the guards weak and afraid. But that was a risk he had already accepted. Far above in the warden's private office, the reptilian commander reviewed the incident reports, the footage showing the human stepping into danger without hesitation. The warden's claw tapped the desk slowly, his mind weighing the meaning of such an action. In his long years, he had seen courage, he had seen cunning, but rarely both in the same prisoner. He closed the screen, with a sharp motion, aware that the balance inside the maw had shifted by a fraction, and in a place built entirely on balance, even the smallest shift could lead to a fall. The storm clouds beyond the dome churned in restless spirals, lightning flashing silently against the distant sky. Inside the prison, the hum of machinery returned to its normal rhythm. Yet for those who had seen the human lift the gate, that day nothing felt quite the same. The guards who once looked at him as a potential threat now looked with something closer to curiosity. The prisoners who once saw him as an easy mark now watched with caution, and somewhere in the shadows plans were already being made to test him again, because in the maw peace was only ever the space between storms. The prison had changed in ways no one expected, and the alien guards felt it every day as they walked through the rusted gates with their weapons ready, but no longer raised in fear for the human, had somehow made this place less of a graveyard and more of a strange home, and the prisoners, who once growled at each other, now shared meals in the mess hall, and even the most violent among them learned to keep their rage in check whenever the human was near, because he had a way of looking at them that cut deeper than any blade, and it was not the look of an enemy, but the look of someone who understood pain and could see the scars no one else noticed. Rumors began to spread through the alien worlds about the strange man from a Deathworld who had walked into the most feared prison in the sector and turned it upside down, without killing anyone, and without demanding respect through fear, and the stories said he did it with simple acts like fixing broken tools, teaching prisoners how to make things, and sharing food with those who had nothing, and some even whispered that the guards were starting to protect him, more than they were protecting the prison itself. One evening, as the artificial sun dimmed, and the cold lamps of the prison yard began to glow, a fight broke out between two alien gangs near the old water tanks, and the air was filled with the sound of claws scraping metal and guttural roars. But before the guards could run in, the human was already there, stepping between the fighters with nothing but his voice and his bare hands, and somehow the noise began to fade as they listened to him speak slowly and clearly, telling them that they could keep fighting until they were both dead, or they could join him in building something better. And no one knew why, but the gangs backed down and walked away without another blow. The guards watching from above exchanged looks of disbelief, and one of them, a tall reptilian officer named Karvek, muttered that this human was doing their job better than they could, and maybe they should just hand him the keys and let him run the place himself. But there was something more than humor in his voice, because deep down they all felt the same. In the weeks that followed, the human began teaching the prisoners new ways to survive without violence, and he showed them how to make fire using scraps, how to mend clothes with thin metal wire, and even how to create simple traps to catch the small insect creatures that crawled through the cracks in the walls at night. And each time a prisoner learned something new, the respect for him grew not out of fear, but out of gratitude and wonder. One night, as the human sat in his cell repairing a broken guard chair, a soft knock came from the bars, and it was Commander Raylos, the highest-ranking officer in the prison, a creature of black chitin armor and glowing orange eyes, who rarely spoke to any prisoner. Yet here he was standing in the dim light and asking if he could come inside, and the human simply nodded and stepped aside. Raylos told him that the prison council was concerned about the changes in the prison because fights had dropped to their lowest level in history, and the supply usage was more efficient than ever, and even the guards had reported higher morale and fewer injuries. And while these things sounded good, the council feared that the human's influence might be dangerous because it was too powerful and too unpredictable, and the commander asked the human directly what his true goal was. The human looked at him for a long moment, then said he only wanted to survive and make this place less of a nightmare, and that if helping others meant he could live one more day, then that was reason enough. And he added that maybe the council feared him because they could not control him, but the truth was they did not need to, because he had no interest in running this place or starting any rebellion, and if they left him to his work they might see that the prison could be something better than it had ever been. Raylo stared at him for a long time before nodding slowly and leaving without another word, and the human returned to his repairs, knowing that the commander was not convinced, but also knowing that seeds of change had been planted in the highest level of the prison authority. A few days later, a supply ship arrived from the outer colonies, and among the cargo was a set of heavy mechanical parts the human had requested weeks ago for a project he had kept secret, and with the help of 2 alien prisoners who had once tried to kill him, he began building something in the far corner of the yard away from the eyes of most guards, and the work went on for hours every day with metal ringing and sparks flying, until slowly a strange structure began to take shape. Some thought it was a weapon, others thought it was a trap, but when the work was finished it was revealed to be a water purifier made from scraps of old ship engines and prison piping, and when it was switched on it began producing clean drinking water for the entire prison, something they had not tasted in years, because the old system had been broken for so long that everyone had given up hope of it ever being fixed. The moment the first drop of clear water touched their lips, the prisoners looked at the human with a kind of awe that no leader or warlord had ever commanded, and the guards too stood silently, knowing that this one act had done more to calm the prison than any threat or punishment ever could. That night, as the lights dimmed and the cold stars shone faintly through the broken roof panels, the human sat alone by the purifier, listening to the quiet hum of its machinery, and for the first time since arriving, he allowed himself to believe that maybe he had a place here, not as a prisoner or a survivor, but as something far stranger and far more dangerous, a symbol of hope in a place built only for despair. The air inside the prison grew heavy as the days passed, and every alien could feel that something was about to happen, because whispers ran through the cells like fire in dry grass, and even the guards, who once laughed with John, now walked with their eyes, scanning every shadow and corner for danger, because something dark had entered the walls, and it was not a human this time, but fear itself. John knew that the prison was a fragile world made of thin threads, and if one thread snapped, the whole place would tear apart. So he kept moving between the different groups, speaking to prisoners in their own languages or in hand signals, and his calm voice carried a strange weight that made even the most violent creatures listen, as if they could feel the truth behind his words. But trouble was growing from the lower levels, where the gangs ruled in silence, and the guards had little power, and a new leader had risen there, a creature with 6 arms and skin like black stone, whose name was Korak, and whose eyes burned with hunger for control, because Korak had heard about the human, who won the respect of the guards and the prisoners alike, and Korak wanted that power for himself. One night, when the moons of the alien world lined up in the sky, and their light poured through the narrow prison windows, a fight broke out between 2 rival groups, and the noise rolled like thunder through the halls, and John ran towards it with 2 guards at his side, because he knew if the fight spread, the entire prison would burn in chaos. In the lower hall the scene was madness, as claws ripped through the air, and chains swung like weapons, and alien voices shouted in rage and fear, and Korak stood in the center, his 6 arms, holding prisoners like toys, and throwing them against the walls as he laughed with a sound that echoed in the bones. John stepped forward through the chaos, not with weapons, but with his hands open and his eyes fixed on Korak, and his voice rose above the screams like a deep drumbeat as he called out that there was no honor in breaking the weak, and that true power came from control and choice, not from fear and cruelty. And his words carried far, because the prisoners stopped for a moment, and even the guards hesitated. Korak looked at him with a slow smile as if amused, and then charged forward with impossible speed, his 6 arms ready to crush the human, but John sidestepped and grabbed one arm, twisting it with a sudden force that shocked everyone, because no one expected a human to move like that, and the sound of bone cracking silenced the hall. The fight between John and Korik was a storm within a storm, because each blow was like a hammer strike, and each dodge like a shadow passing, and the prisoners formed a circle around them, watching with eyes wide and breaths held, as if the outcome would decide the fate of them all. John fought not like a predator, but like a survivor, using the environment to his advantage, kicking off walls, sliding under attacks, grabbing chains to swing around Korik's neck. And with every move he showed that the human body, though smaller, could be as dangerous as any alien weapon when driven by will and necessity. At last Korik stumbled, his knees bending under a heavy blow to the chest, and John grabbed him by the throat, lifting his voice for all to hear, saying that the prison belonged to no gang and no tyrant, and if anyone wanted peace they would stand with him and the guards who treated them with fairness. Something shifted then in the air like a weight lifting, and the prisoners looked at each other, and many stepped forward to show their choice, and Korik's own followers lowered their heads knowing the fight was lost, and John released the gang leader, letting him fall to his knees in defeat, but not in death, because killing him would only start another chain of revenge. The guards moved in to take Korik away, and for the first time in years the lower halls fell silent, not from fear, but from a strange calm, and John knew this was only the first step in building something different in the prison, a fragile balance that might break again at any time, but for now it held. That night the guards shared their food with the prisoners in the main hall, a thing that had never happened before, and John sat among them listening to their stories about their worlds and their pasts, and he realized that many of them were not evil by nature, but trapped by choices made long ago, or by the systems that had thrown them into this alien hell. As the lights dimmed and the cold of the night seeped into the stone walls, John looked up at the moons again and thought of Earth, wondering if anyone there knew what he had become in this place, and if they would ever believe that in the worst prison on a Deathworld a human had become not just a survivor, but a bridge between enemies. The storm inside the prison had passed for now, but in the shadows new storms were forming, and John knew he would have to face them with the same resolve, because this place was no longer just a prison to him, it was a battlefield. For something far greater than survival, it was a place where he could show what humanity meant even to those who had never seen Earth or felt its sun, and he was not going to let it fall into darkness again. The air inside the alien hell prison was heavy with a strange energy, as if the walls themselves could sense that something was coming, something final, something that would not end quietly. Yarrick stood in the middle of the main yard, his eyes moving from one side to the other, his body tense, but calm. He had been in fights before, he had survived battles on more than one world, but this felt different. It was not just about survival now, it was about ending this place and everything it stood for. Around him the guards were tense too, but not because they feared him in the way they had once feared other inmates. No, they feared for him, because they knew that once the riot started, the warden would unleash the Black Enforcers, the most brutal unit in the entire galaxy. These were not guards, these were killers, and once they were released no one was safe. The prisoners had gathered too, their eyes fixed on Yarrick. Some of them trusted him, others simply wanted to be part of whatever chaos he was about to start. The alien gangs that had once fought each other now stood side by side, united by one strange human who had turned their world upside down. The sirens began to howl, echoing through the high steel corridors, and the light turned red, a deep throbbing red that made every shadow stretch and twist. The gates at the far end of the yard began to open, and the Black Enforcers marched in. Their armor was thick and jagged, their faces hidden behind black visors. They carried weapons that looked like they were made to tear through bone and stone alike. Yarrick did not move at first. He let them come closer. He let them see him standing tall, without fear. Then he raised his hand, and the entire yard erupted into movement. Prisoners surged forward like a wave. Guards moved with them, not against them. For the first time in the history of this prison, the walls saw guards and prisoners fighting side by side against the real enemy. The clash was brutal. The sound of metal against metal filled the air. The Black Enforcers hit hard, but Yarrick was faster. He moved like water flowing around strikes, his fists and elbows landing with precision, breaking armor plates and sending the dark shapes staggering back. One of the enforcers swung a heavy blade at him. Yarrick caught it with both hands, the edge biting into his palms, but he twisted, pulling the weapon free and smashing the handle into the visor of his opponent. Glass and metal shattered, and the figure fell without a sound. All around him the battle raged. Prisoners tackled enforcers, To the ground, guards used their shock batons not to punish, but to protect the Ingenuity, and that moment was something the prison had never seen, something the warden could never have imagined. The warden himself appeared on the balcony above, his voice booming through the loudspeakers, demanding that the fighting stop. But no one listened. His orders meant nothing now. The balance of power had shifted. Yarrick climbed onto the base of the central tower, his voice carrying across the yard. He spoke of freedom, of ending the cycle of cruelty, of showing the galaxy that even in a place built for hate, unity could grow. His words were simple, but they cut through the noise like a blade. With a final push, the enforcers began to fall back, their numbers cut down, their armor broken, and there was shaken. The gates they had entered through now became the gates they fled through, leaving behind weapons and gear. The prisoners and guards stood together, breathing hard, looking at each other with a strange mix of exhaustion and disbelief. They had won this fight, but the war for their future was not over. The warden shouted for reinforcements, but none came. The communication lines had been cut. Someone had planned for this moment, someone who wanted Yarrick to succeed. Yarrick turned toward the inner gates leading to the control center. He moved quickly, with a small group of guards and prisoners following behind. The hallways were empty. The fear that once lived in every corner, now replaced by the sound of footsteps and the smell of smoke from burning equipment. When they reached the control room, the warden was waiting, holding a weapon aimed at them, his eyes burning with anger. He shouted at Yarrick to surrender, but Yarrick only walked forward, his voice steady, telling the warden it was over, telling him that this place would never again be a cage for anyone. The warden fired, but the shot missed. Yarrick had already moved, closing the distance and knocking the weapon away. With one sharp strike, the fight was short. The warden was strong, but not strong enough. Yarrick left him on the floor, alive but beaten. They took control of the systems, opening the main gates of the prison for the first time in years. The outside light spilled in cold and bright. It touched the faces of prisoners and guards alike, and for a moment they all just stood there feeling it. Some chose to leave, running into the wilderness beyond the walls. Others stayed, knowing that freedom was more than just walking out a gate. It was about building something new and safe. Yarrick stood at the threshold, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew that whatever came next would not be easy, but he also knew that this moment would be remembered not as the day a riot broke out, but as the day a human in an alien hell prison changed everything. The guards who had once been his enemies stood beside him, now ready to face whatever came next. The prisoners who had once feared him now looked at him as a leader. The warden's voice was gone, replaced by the sound of the wind through the open gates. And so Yarrick stepped forward into the unknown, his boots crunching against the stone, his shadow stretching long behind him. The prison shrinking in the distance, a place that had once been a cage, now just another mark in the long, strange journey of a Deathworld human who had gone to hell and found a way to make even the guards love him.